Thank you very much, Mr. Mudassir Issa, for your introductory remarks. And before I start, I would like to use this opportunity to thank all participants who have found our flyer worthy, the information we have shared around worthy to join us this morning. In fact, this is the beginning of a number of seminars we want to embark on. And we are hoping that this session will be an enjoyable and interesting and an eye-opening session. And we will continue to see how we can network and learn from each other. As Mr. Mudassir has already indicated, this seminar is being organized by the Center for ICT for D Research. And the Center for ICT for D Research is a very young center, and we have quite a bit of a history that goes back to somewhere around 2016. But before I just give you a brief idea about what we are into and what we are about and who are the brains behind the center, I would like to just take a little bit of your time to emphasize again that at the, wait just a minute. Do you see my screen? I think I've lost.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, so we have quite of a bit of a history, and I would like to just use this opportunity to quickly run through that. But before I do, I would like to mention that from the Center for ICT for D Research, we are committed to embarking on research that will provide high quality results and findings, which will aid business continuity as well as help in our societal and our national development at large. As part of some of the things we'll be doing, we'll be embarking on some kind of specialized professional development courses as part of our capacity building initiatives, as well as embarking on some IT solutions that will be very crucial for digital transformation, especially for small business enterprises in the developing country context. As part of our history, I would say that the Center for ICT for D Research has its history as way back as 2016, when I first met Mr. Mudassir Issa, our moderator, as one of my undergraduate students. And his IT skills, his great IT skills awed me. And I quickly struck a relationship between the two. There was quickly a relationship between the two of us. Now, in 2017, I met the second presenter, Mr. Muftau Jang Alasan, who officially became my teaching assistant in 2017. This is a guy with great energy and a passion for research. And given Mr. Mudassir IT, interest in IT and his IT skills, the three of us kind of struck some kind of familiarity, and our interests merged, and we came up with the idea for setting up this particular center. But even before then, me and Muda had set up a think tank called TechLens, but TechLens didn't last that very long, and we still have our office space in Wa. Moving forward to 2022, the three of us, after embarking on several different activities and careers, came back together, and the Center for ICT for D Research was born. So we are quite a very young center, just formed early part of this year. So we go way back from 2016 when TechLens was formed, to 2020 when we had a renewed ICT for D research interest, and a new horizon of collaboration was born between a technical person who is Mr. Mudassir Issa and two academics, me and Mr. Muftau Jang Alasan. And then at the Center for ICT for D Research, we want to be able to leverage on the synergy that the three of us would bring to the table. So three of us currently constitute the membership of the Center for ICT for D Research, and we are the 3 founders of the center. And that is me there. I'm Ibrahim Osman Adam, and I will be the first presenter. Popularly, my friends and colleagues call me Iblam. And there you are with Mr. Muftau Jang Alasan, popularly called Mufti, and then Mr. Issa Mudassir. Mr. Issa Mudassir is a back-end developer who has got several years experience as a developer. He has supported enterprises in Africa, especially in East Africa, and locally in Ghana. So at the Center for ICT for D Research, we have quite a number of services that we render. Though we are just about 6 months old, we have done quite a number of things. We are into academic and applied research publishing. So we are interested in contributing academically to the discourse in ICT for D research, the policy discourse, practice discourse in the country and beyond. As I have also indicated, we are also into capacity building, and we are organizing a number of training programs for to increase personal productivity as well as organizational productivity. Technically, we are also into web design and web development, and we offer unique web development services for different kinds of organizations. We are also interested in offering tailor-made IT solutions for local, small and medium enterprises. Largely as part of our ICT for D initiatives, we intend to roll out a number of innovative programs that will contribute largely to the SD, the Sustainable Development Goals. In all of this, we offer an open door collaborative policy or initiatives, and our doors are open, and we welcome all forms of collaboration from individuals, organizations out there to be able to contribute our quota to societal and national development. We are also currently leveraging a lot on social media, so you can follow us on Facebook, you can like our page. We also have a Twitter handle. Very soon we also have an Instagram handle. So briefly, this is who we are and what we are into. Thank you very much for listening. And then I will now go straight into the main program for the day. I will be presenting on how to write a research paper for a refereed conference or journal. And to do this presentation, I would be looking at it from 2 main aspects. For the first aspect, I will largely give you an intro, and this intro basically would be about the basic things one needs to know if you want to publish your stuff out there, your research findings out there. After that, I would lay bare the critical components of a research paper. This is actually the critical part of the seminar. I will indicate the critical components of a research paper, and individually we'll take the components one after the other and see how we can delve into them, how we can digest them to the understanding of participants and everybody. Okay. Then finally, we'll have a Q&A session and a feedback session. And I believe that the feedback or the Q&A session would not end at the end of this seminar. We have a Facebook page where we can continue the discussion on a lot of things. We are also intending to have maybe a bigger WhatsApp platform where we can share ideas on the way forward. All right. So the first part is to basically look at the key things one needs to understand if you want to publish. If you want to, in fact, to be able to publish, you cannot publish without having a research idea. So everything hinges on what research idea you have. And this research idea, you should be able to translate this research idea into a topic which is either contemporary, a topic that is trendy, a topic that is interesting and will be relevant for your audience. So if you intend to publish your research in a particular journal, the findings of your research should be of interest to the readers of that particular journal. Your research should also have very clear aims and objectives. The objectives should be very clear and unambiguous. The aim should be very clear. And the expected impact of your research should also not be ambiguous. Now, most often times, we miss out on what the critical motivation may be for our research. And when one intends to publish, the motivation for the research should be clearly stated. Your motivation should also be clear. Apart from that, if you are going to conduct study, either quantitative or qualitative, you must have explicit research hypothesis. Your research questions should be very clear, and the research questions or hypothesis should follow logically from the literature you may have reviewed. Apart from that, to be able to conduct research and have robust findings that can stand the test of time, you will have to use a sound research method. You need to use a sound research method because it is through this sound research method that you can have an empirical analysis that will be performed to a higher academic standard. Whatever one intends to do, whatever phenomena one intends to investigate, the implications of the study should be clear. The practical implications, the implications for research, the implications for practice and policy should be very clear and also unambiguous. Now, the contribution to literature should also be very clear, and very soon we'll see how we can position, we'll look at how one can position your research initiative, your research idea, or your research topic, so that you'll be able to have critical contributions to literature or to theory. I have come across many early stage academics or early career researchers who have all these rudiments as part of their research, but they are still struggling to ensure that their research findings are published. And probably it may be because they are not able to write clearly. So you can have all these things in place, but if you are not able to write clearly, coherently, your research may not find its way into a credible journal. And when we are talking about publishing here, we are not talking about just publishing anyhow. We are talking about publishing in a credible journal. There are journals out there that you can, whatever crooked findings you have, you can pay and get them published. We refer to them as predatory journals. These are not the kind of publishing we are talking about. We are talking about publishing in high-ranking, high-impact journals. So these are the basic things one needs to know if you want to publish. If you can get these things properly done, easily, you can get your research findings into a journal which is of high impact. Now, those of us in academia and those of you who are interested in joining academia, we in academia, we sign up to the mantra of either you publish or you perish. And some of you may have heard this particular phrase. This particular phrase, publish or perish, is a call to action. It's a call to action because if you are working in a research institution or you are working in academia, there's no way you can grow without publishing. And this particular phrase is very well known to many academics out there. And remember, I started in the first part by saying that to be able to publish, you must have a research idea. And this research idea should be interesting to your readers. It should be relevant to the journal you intend to publish it in. Having the research idea is not enough. If you are an academic or you are a researcher and you have a wonderful, the most brilliant research idea, if you are not able to publish it, you will still perish. Even if you are able to collect data, good data, you are able to conduct very fine analysis of the data, you come up with very fine findings, and you are not able to publish it, you will still perish. Even when you have written up your findings, you have written your paper, you will still perish because you are not able. So the critical thing is for you to be able to perish. And we hope that with these seminars we are going to be embarking on, we'll be able to help colleagues who are interested in publishing to have an easy way of learning how to go through the publishing process in a very easy and safe way. Now, the critical components of a research paper that one needs to know if you want to get your paper in a high impact journal out there are this. The critical components are your paper must have a title. So I'm going to just list the components of a research paper, and then we'll take each component one after the other to try and find out what should go into each component. So the critical components are your paper must have a title. The title may go through several iterations to become perfect. Okay, then you must have an abstract with some keywords. Also, the main body of the paper should have an introduction where you would have an overview, the objective, the research problem, the questions, and whatnot. Then you should also conduct some kind of a literature review. Depending on the style you are adopting, the literature review may involve aspects of your hypothesis development. If you are conducting a quantitative study, it may also have aspect of the literature that looks at your, maybe your conceptual framework, an aspect of the literature that looks at your theory, the theoretical foundation on which your study is going to be built. As a matter of style, some will separate the literature review, which may consist of the hypothesis development, if it's a quantitative study, or just a literature review. Some may separate it from the theoretical or conceptual framework. So we may have a literature review section or a conceptual or theoretical section. Others may combine this section as well. Then we have the methodology section where you will clearly indicate what your research method is, your sources of data, how the data will be collected, how the data will be analyzed, and how you are going to come about your findings. Then the next stage would be the empirical analysis, which will present some descriptive analysis, your research findings, whether the hypotheses are rejected, and how your research questions may be answered. Then tying your literature review to whatever findings you may have come up, you will need to discuss the findings in relation, the findings that has emerged as a result of your analysis in relation to the literature review you may have conducted. Because as part of your literature review process, you may have come up with some gaps. So it is at the discussion stage that you discuss these gaps in relation to the existing literature by clearly indicating how your findings agree with existing literature or how it departs from existing literature. And then finally, you would have your conclusion sections, which will be the summary of your key findings. What we're going to do in the next sections would be to look at each of these sections in detail and see what critical things can be handled under each of them. So the first would be to look at the title of a paper, the title of a paper. What are the critical things or the components I need to look at if I want to have a very good title? Remember that the research, the title of your paper will be the first thing people will read. It will be the first thing people will need. So you should be able to capture the reader's attention to the research problem you want to investigate and the main ideas of your proposal or the main ideas of your research paper. So because it is going to be read first, it should be captivating so that it will be able to capture your readers or your audience interest. The third thing is that your title, the title of your paper should contain very few words. Very few words are needed to describe the scope and the contributions of your study. And largely, we say that your title should be between 8 to 15 words. It should not be too short. It should not be too long. And in coming up with your title, always make sure that you avoid abbreviations and use words that will create a positive impression of what you want to put out, the phenomena you are trying to investigate. It should be able to stimulate the interest of your readers. Okay. The fifth one would be to suggest in your title. Maybe you can suggest how the relationship between some of the variables you intend to investigate. So you can suggest a relationship between variables which support the major hypothesis of your paper, if it is a quantitative one. The safe one is that you should not include unnecessary words in the title. So for instance, words like a case study of maybe Tamale Metropolis, you should take such things out, an analysis of so and so, you should take it out. It is important that you remove these unnecessary words because the moment a title is indicated, we know that it is a study of something. You don't necessarily have to bring in the words a study of or an analysis of. Now, when we are also coming up with a title, we should remember that usually the title of a paper is in the form of a phrase, but it can also be in the form of a question. So you may come across titles of research papers, academic papers, which are not necessarily a phrase, but in the form of a question. It can come not just an absolute statement, but in the form of a question. And when we are coming up with our title of our research, we have to use the correct grammar and use proper capitalizations. These days, there are nifty tools out there that can help you check your grammar without sending it to a professional, spending so much on a professional editor out there. So these are the critical things you need to understand when you are coming out with your paper. It should not be very lengthy. You should avoid unnecessary words. Remember that your title is the first thing people will read before they even go to either the abstract or some other aspects of your paper. So you have to make sure that it captures your readers' attention. The next critical component is the abstract. And the abstract provides some kind of a summary of what is contained in the main paper. So your abstract should clearly indicate first the purpose of the paper. what are the objectives, what is the aim of the paper. You have to clearly indicate it. So whether you are writing a research paper or you are writing a thesis, your abstract should clearly indicate that. And for some academics, they would usually start the abstract by clearly indicating that the purpose of this study is to, and then they will just state it clearly. That's how others do it. Others will start it with a preamble. They'll start the abstract with a preamble. Then after the preamble, they may come up with the purpose of the paper. Now, after the purpose of the paper, it is important that you indicate the gap or the problem that the paper seeks to address. So you can subtly just put it there, that despite ABC, research on so and so phenomena has concentrated so much on this, but not on this. That is why this study is going to do ABC. When you have clearly indicated this, you need to also indicate what research design, the methodology, the approach you are going to use to be able to achieve the objectives you have clearly indicated. Then you should also indicate the main methods you will use for your research, what is the theoretical lens that you are going to use, and what will be the scope of the thesis. So the design methodology or the approach is also very critical. The third critical component would be for you to indicate what was found. This refers to the analysis, the results, or the discussion section. So a sentence or two indicating clearly what was found in the study is also very important. And then lastly, you have to clearly also indicate the original contribution which the thesis is bringing out, the paper is bringing out. You have to clearly indicate what is new in this thesis, what is new in the paper by indicating that. You can also conclude your paper by indicating that your research profiles some implications for research, practice, and policy. Because of the limitations of the abstract, you have to be very choosy with your words and very careful so that you don't write so much in there. Some journals will require that an abstract should be about 150 words. Some may extend it to the extent of 250 words. So depending on the journal you are looking at, your abstract should be what? It should just be a summary by looking at this critical component. The purpose should be clearly indicated. The gap should be clear. The methodology, the theory you are using should be clear. What was found, and also the original contribution you are making. Now, after the title, the abstract, maybe a number of keywords, we need to delve into the actual content of the paper. What goes into an academic paper, apart from the title, the body of an academic paper, apart from the title, the abstract, what goes in there? Now, the next critical component we need to look at is the introduction of the paper. The introduction of the paper. And the introductory aspect of the paper has other important components. So we'll take a step back, look at the introduction alone. What are the components? And then we pick each component of the introduction, and then we look at the subcomponent that fits or that should be part of the introduction of a research paper. So when you have an introduction of a research paper, the first thing the introduction should cover should be the background of the study. What is the background? The background basically will provide the nature of the problem or provide an overview of the problem that is going to be investigated by this paper. Your introduction should also clearly indicate what the research problem is. What is problematic that you are trying to solve by conducting this particular study. Then thirdly, the third point would be for you to clearly indicate in your introduction the aim, the purpose, the objective, and your motivations for this particular paper. What do you seek to achieve, and why is it important and appropriate at this time that you investigate this particular phenomenon? Here, you may present a number of research questions if possible, or objectives if possible. Then the fourth aspect will be for you to clearly indicate the contribution of this paper. What is the contribution of this paper? Then the fifth aspect will be for you to summarize some findings in a couple of sentences. What did your data reveal? What did your data reveal? The detailed findings of your paper will be indicated in the findings and discussions and the later sections, but you also need to summarize, put a summary of the findings as part of the introduction, so that whoever is reading this doesn't necessarily have to read the whole paper to understand what the findings of this paper are. And then the last aspect will be for you to indicate clearly the structure of your paper. How would the rest of the paper be structured? what should they expect? You have to clearly indicate how the rest of the paper is structured. So these are the components of an introductory section of a research paper or an academic paper. So we'll take it one after the other. What should go into the background? What should go into the background? Now, the background basically presents information and identifies or describes the history and nature of the phenomena we want to look at. The nature of a well-defined research phenomena. We have to present the background here, the history and the nature of the problem in the background. The background information usually will include the root of the problem we are investigating. It will indicate that. It will also indicate the scope of the problem and the extent to which previous studies have successfully looked at this or examined this particular problem. And in doing this, one will have to note in particular where gaps exist that the paper attempts to address. But we will subtly do this because we will not have to indicate clearly what the gaps are in the background, because there's another section where the gaps will clearly be indicated. Also, as part of the introductory session, the introductory background needs to clearly show a difference from the literature review that will follow. The literature review and the background should be different. The introductory background information differs from a literature review because, or it places the literature, the research problem in a proper context. That's what the background does. It places the research problem in a proper context. It is not thoroughly examining the related literature, but placing or putting the research problem we intend to investigate in a proper context. That's what the background of the introduction will do. The next section or next paragraph will look at the research aims and objectives. You have to clearly indicate what the objectives, and usually what we often come across is that people would indicate what the general aim is or the general objectives and the specific objectives. Many of us here are familiar with this particular approach. So what is the difference between an aim and an objective? What's the general aim, or what people will call the general objective usually? What is the difference? We usually will say that the aim is the goal that the research is trying to achieve. The aim of the research is the goal that the research is trying to achieve. Whilst the objective is the practical steps or the series of steps or activities we need to go through to be able to achieve the research aim. So usually we may come across phrases like the aim of the objective, the aim of the study is to do A, B, C. And the objective is to indicate 1, 2, 3, 4. So usually we would come across instances where an objective or aim will be clearly stated as indicated in the examples below. And usually the difference between the objective and the aim is that the aim is usually about the what, whilst the objective is about the how. So a typical example would be a phrase like this: the aim of this article is to do A, B, C. And to achieve this aim, we have what? 3 objectives, and then we state it clearly. Now, if you look at this example, let me show you an example. If you look at this example 1, it clearly indicates that the purpose of this study is to examine globally the effects of ICT access and ICT use on digital inclusion on one hand, and the mediating role of ICT usage on the linkage between ICT access and digital inclusion on the other. This is a typical example. So with some papers, they may not necessarily differentiate between what the aim is or the objective is. They will just indicate the purpose of this paper is to do this, and then they will move on with that. Another example is as seen in example 2. In this paper, we aim to answer an important question of investigating whether corporate governance affects firms' decision to voluntarily disclose ABC. So it's a matter of style and semantics, how a researcher may want to phrase the research aim or the objective, or whether you want to go with the style of just indicating what your research purpose is, without necessarily indicating individual objectives. But if you are doing a thesis, if you're writing a thesis, obviously you will have to clearly indicate what your purpose is and indicate the specific objectives that the study seeks to achieve. And then that will follow with a series of questions that the study seeks to answer. And in answering these questions, the study would have achieved the objectives and the purpose, the overall purpose of the study that is clearly indicated. Okay. Now, the next thing is for us to look at what we refer to as the research problem. All of this still come under the section introduction, the introductory aspect of the paper. most often than not, where early career academics have a problem is writing the research problem, clearly indicating what the research problem is. The research problem basically is an issue or a concern that a researcher presents. And in presenting this, you have to go on to justify why it is important that you investigate this particular problem. So graphically, we often say that in simply understanding what a research problem is, we say that it is basically the difference between what is actually happening and what should be happening. And that is where we can clearly situate our research problem. Now, in selecting a research problem, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that a practical problem should always be differentiated from a research problem. So oftentimes, our students may come to do their presentation and they will indicate that the reason why they are conducting this study is that he or she works in a local government authority and they're having problems with revenue generation. So he wants to conduct research to find out how they can improve that. In actual fact, when you do this, you are not presenting a research problem. You are just indicating a practical problem. And with these practical problems, though it is researchable, the kind of research problem we are looking at in this kind of studies are not necessarily practical problems, but they are problems that are grounded in what? In the literature. So in indicating what a research problem is, we oftentimes say that you have to problematize the literature. So you have to find fault with existing literature, what existing literature has discussed. And then you would see a gap there that you would need to fill. But if there's a practical problem out there and you think that we need to investigate this practical problem, you would then have to be able to make that a sound research problem. You have to go into the literature to find out if other researchers have not actually looked at this problem and whether people have not actually published in this particular area. If people have not done that, then you will have to problematize the literature by finding out what the literature in this particular area has addressed. And the fact that it has not addressed this practical problem in your workplace, then you can present that as a research problem for the purposes of an academic paper or your thesis. But without doing that, you can't just pick a problem from your workplace and say that that's a research problem. You need to investigate. It should be grounded in what? In the literature. Now, there are key considerations one needs to consider in selecting a research problem. One is the interest of the researcher. If you are not interested in this particular phenomena you are investigating, the problem you want to investigate, research is a very boring and can be a very daunting process. So your interest in the subject matter, the phenomena you are investigating, is key, is very critical. Apart from interest, apart from your personal interest, what is the interest of your supervisor? What is the interest of the journal you want to publish in this particular problem? All these are very important. Apart from that, you also need to look at the magnitude of the problem. The problem shouldn't be too huge. In fact, we often make a joke that you can't change the world with your research. So you have to just situate your research problem in a niche area. Your contribution will be very small, minute, and you have to critically examine what others have done and what they have left out. And then you situate your problem over there, you situate your research there and deal with the problem and move on. So your research problem should not be too broad. It should not also be what? Too narrow. Now, the next important thing is the measurement of concepts. If you want to look at a particular phenomenon and say you are looking at a quantitative study, and this study is trying to examine the relationship between a number of constructs, you have to clearly ask yourself how these constructs are going to be measured. You have to understand that there are some constructs out there that are not directly observable. So you cannot measure them directly. So if you are looking at two constructs or the relationship between two variables, and these two variables cannot directly be measured, then you have to look at a proxy. What proxy will you use to be able to measure that? Usually we call those constructs that or variables out there that we cannot directly measure as latent variables. So with this latent variable, what proxy are you going to use to be able to measure that? All this should be clear in your mind when you are couching or setting out to clearly define what your research problem is. Your level of expertise is also very important. If you are a novice researcher and you go embarking on a research study to explore or address a problem that a research problem that is very huge, your study will suffer because you don't have the expertise to be able to do that. So oftentimes we leverage on collaboration so that we can create some kind of a synergy. So that if I don't have the expertise quantitatively to be able to deal with an issue, I can collaborate with a researcher who has the quantitative expertise to be able to collaborate with me so that we'll be able to address the level of expertise problem. We will address the expertise problem and we'll be able to carry out the study. The relevance of your study is also very important. How relevant is this problem that you are trying to address? I have submitted a paper to a journal a long time ago, and the feedback I got back was that they have moved on with the discussion of this particular phenomenon. So it means I was far, far behind. The relevance of the study, the study wasn't relevant. So I had to really look at the problem and situate the problem in a way that the research problem will be contemporary, it will be trendy, and it will appeal to the audience that I am targeting. Apart from this, the availability of data. This problem that you intend to investigate, where are you going to get the data? Will the participants agree? There's usually what we call gaining access. For instance, you want to conduct a qualitative study and you are targeting that you would use the University for Development Studies as the case organization. But you are not even sure, you don't know anybody there. So you are not even sure whether the university will allow you to interview its staff, because maybe the area or the phenomena you are investigating is a very dicey issue. Nobody wants to talk about that. So the university may not give you the clearance to do that. So it is important that we consider the availability of data. And gaining access to the organization or gaining access is at two levels. Access to the organization is one level, and access when even you are promised that, maybe some high-level officials in the organization have promised you that when you come, I will let you interview the workers there. So you are assured. But it is it's still 50-50. When you gain access into the organization and you want to interview the participants may not agree, their schedules may not agree. So these levels of access needs to also be looked at, and all of this contribute to the availability of your data. So you need to be sure of the data before you go on to trying to see how you can use your research to address this problem. And finally, ethical issues. You have to make sure that your research is not disadvantaging somebody. And also the issue of confidentiality and all the whatnot would have to be dealt with as part of your, so these are critical considerations a researcher needs to consider in coming out with a problem. And then when you have dealt with all of this, in as well as problematizing the literature to support, if it is a practical problem, it should be rooted in the literature. If it is not, and it's just an ordinary research problem, it should also be rooted in the literature. When you have done all of this and taken these considerations into account, your research problem will transmogrify into a progress in what? In your research. It will change into progress in your research. Now, the next thing I want us to look at will be to look at some examples of how a research problem may clearly be indicated. And I will draw on some of the things we have done in the past. A typical example is a study we conducted we got published in 2021. And I'll just read through that so that you see what the problem is. It says, in the past, the discourse on e-participation in the information systems literature has concentrated on how technology access generally serves as a factor for citizens' e-participation. Then it goes on to say that specifically, ICT access and ICT usage have largely been examined as separate key factors in IT deployment, even though ICT access and ICT usage are complementary factors whose presence are mutually exclusive in achieving IT deployment. So basically, there's a problem there. We're saying that though whatever we're looking at here is not new, they have looked at this particular phenomenon, ICT access, ICT usage, as influences of e-participation as different variables. They have looked at it individually. So we say that these two constructs are usually tied together. When you have access, you have to use. Before you can use, you must have access. So we say that instead of saying that ICT access affects e-participation, what has been done in the literature, or individually saying that ICT usage affects e-participation, we are saying that the two should always be looked at together. So what we have basically done here is that we have problematized what others have done in the past, what Joe and Song, Krishnan and Tio and Co have done by looking at individual effects of ICT usage on e-participation, and then ICT access on e-participation. In our study, we combine the two to look at the effect of the two factors on e-participation by indicating that the two factors should not be looked at individually. There's also a second example, a research we published somewhere last year, and it states, evidence from the literature points to a research focus on e-learning. So we are problematizing the literature. We're saying there's literature, but the literature focuses on what? Research on e-learning. And we have cited some guys there, and the virtual learning environment. And we are saying that less attention has been paid to researching the administrative work environment and how it will improve information management. So you see that we are clearly indicating that there's a problem with what others have done, whilst acknowledging what others have done in the past by concentrating on e-learning and the virtual learning environment. They have not actually looked at the administrative work environment. And that's where the problem is. And we are saying that when we look at the administrative work environment, we can help in improving information management in higher education institutions. So this is how, these are just few examples of how the research problem, how the literature can be problematized to concretize what a research problem should be, so that we can have a good research problem. Now, the next aspect of the introduction is for us to look at the contribution. You have to clearly also indicate how your paper is contributing to research. Now, I am from the information systems field, and in information systems, especially in information system, interpretive studies in information systems, what constitutes a contribution to knowledge is clearly indicated. It's clearly indicated by Walsham and Co. And they even refer to what constitutes a contribution to knowledge as qualitative generalization as a content of contribution. So we need to be clear what our contribution is in this particular paper, or what our contribution is in our thesis. It should be clear and unambiguous. One critical way one can show a contribution in your paper, as indicated by Walsham and Co., is that you have to clearly indicate if your study will lead to the development of a new concept. And it may be that there is a particular phenomenon out there. We often say that there is nothing new under the sun. So the fact that there's nothing new under the sun, everything is already out there. But those things that are out there can be discovered. And then you can propound a name for this particular phenomenon. You can come up with a name for, if your study leads to that, the development of a new concept, then we can say that your study is contributing to what? Is contributing to knowledge. So the development of a new concept could involve the first, you can say that this paper is the first to do ABC. You are developing a new concept. Or it could be offering rich insight into a particular phenomenon. It is bringing to bear aspects of explaining aspects of a particular phenomenon that people have never thought of in a particular way. You are offering rich insight into a particular phenomenon. It can also be considered as what? Your papers or your thesis contribution. Your paper may also, or your research may also lead to the generation of new theory. In this case, it means that your study is going to lead to the development of a theory. If you are embarking on some kind of a grounded theory research, it may lead to the development of a new theory, or you may be extending an existing theory in your field in a novel way. Lastly, Walsham and Co. indicates that if your study provides specific implications, you may also be contributing to knowledge. So you can also indicate as part of your introduction that your paper provides specific implications. And the specific implications could be implications for maybe academics research, or it could be implications for practitioners out there, or it could be providing specific implications for policy, maybe for governance. But generally, these four components are critical components indicated by Walsham and Co. in information systems studies. But generally, what do we consider as key contributions to knowledge? Oftentimes, we may come across some of this. If your article should be able to provide at least one of the following incremental contributions, it is only then and then that we can say that your article is contributing to the literature, to theory, to the methodology, or to practice. Contribution to knowledge. It could be that your paper is the first article or the first paper, or your thesis is the first to examine this particular phenomena in this particular way. You can emphasize that. It could also be that your paper aims to introduce a practical solution to a practical problem in practice, especially when your study is an action research. Your action research may be geared towards producing a problem or coming up with a solution to a practical problem out there. Your study may also be leading to the introduction of a new measure. You are introducing a new measure for a particular phenomenon. Maybe that phenomena, nobody has come up with how to measure that phenomena in that novel way, and you are coming out with a new measure for that phenomena. That can also be a contribution to your study. And then lastly, theoretical contribution. Your research introduces a new theory to the field. It tests a particular theory and then extends the theory in some way. And then I'll give an example. A typical example of a potential or a typical example of a contribution is seen in this particular paragraph. And this is culled from a paper we published in a 3-star journal, the Information System Frontiers. I published with Professor John Ifa from the University of Ghana Business School. So I'll just read that out. It clearly indicates that our findings show that despite the popular belief that a subject can be unitary in the application of activity theory, the subject can be be a dyad of a principal and agent in an outsourcing relationship. And it goes on to say that the theoretical basis of this work is that the activity theory idea of the subject needs to be re-examined through the decomposition to account for a duality of the subject. This study, to our knowledge, reports on a different perspective on the subject in information system research. So clearly we argue in this study that there is a theory out there called activity theory, and this theory indicates that there should always be a subject. But we come to argue that despite the fact that there will be a subject, this subject needs to be looked at in terms of what? A dyad, two subjects, a principal or an agent. And this is an example of a unique contribution. Then still under the introductory session, you need to clearly indicate summary of your key findings by starting this particular paragraph with our results show that ABC. Our analysis show that we provide evidence that we find that. Now you can also combine the summary session with the contribution session. You can do that. You can also combine those two sessions. Now the last aspect of the introductory aspect of the research paper is to look at the structure of the paper. What is the structure of your paper? And to indicate the structure of your paper, you have to start a new paragraph by indicating the paper is organized as follows. So whatever you would have indicated would be the first section of your paper. And then you go on to say that the paper is organized as follows. Section 2 provides ABC, a review of the literature. Section 3 presents the theoretical background or theoretical foundation of the study, while section 4 is, this is followed by section 4, where the research methodology, detailing out your data sources, the data collection, and how the analysis is going to be done. This is where it's presented. Then the 5th, 6th, and 7th section. If you are looking at the qualitative study, we'll look at your case description, your case analysis, and the discussion of your findings. And then lastly, you should have your section 8, and your section 8 will be your concluding section. This study will conclude your study and presents the implications of your study for practice and policy. So this is the first part of your research paper, the introduction section. That's the introduction section. The next critical section, which is the section 2, is the literature review. And the literature review should clearly demonstrate that you as a researcher, you are aware of the existing debates in your area. And you have to make references to key articles and texts and show that you appreciate what is being discussed, the discourse in your area. And the purpose of the literature review is to demonstrate your knowledge and your familiarity with the literature in your field. Your literature review will indicate critically that you have surveyed relevant literature on this topical issue in relation to the phenomena you are looking at. Your research, your literature review should also show that you as a researcher has understood all the key issues around the topic. And then you should be able to present the gaps. your research, your literature review should come up with the clear gaps which exist in what? In prior studies. And then you indicate how this study you are conducting will fill all these gaps. Now, several different gaps may be indicated. There are, depending on the text you are looking at, the gaps are classified differently. Others may refer to the evidence gap. And before I present this, when we say a gap, what basically do we mean? We mean the gap is an area for which there is missing or insufficient evidence. And this lack of evidence limits the ability to reach a conclusion on this particular issue. That's where what we call a research gap. And the research gap, if you look at the literature, you'll be able to come up with evidence of this gap. So we may call that evidence or empirical gap, which will clearly indicate that maybe the findings are contradicting and how your study is going to address the conflicts in the findings. So the conflicts in the previous studies. So we may call that an evidence or empirical gap. Then we may also have what we call maybe a knowledge gap. And the knowledge gap may not exist in the actual field, but maybe when you look at the literature, the results of the study will differ from what maybe was expected. And then we may also have a methodological gap as well as what? A theory gap. And gaps in the theory, if we look at the prior literature, the theory which propounds or explains a particular phenomenon in a particular way, in a particular context, may not be applicable in a particular context. So there may also be what we refer to as a context gap. And then that's why I'm saying that depending on literature, the gaps may be classified differently. Now, the next thing for us to look at, major thing, is the research questions. And with the research questions, here, you need to show a clear link between the research questions and your hypothesis or your objectives. There should always be a linkage. You cannot have 3 objectives and then you come and have maybe 2 questions. There should be a sync between the 2 of them. Depending on whether you are conducting a quantitative or qualitative study, your research questions may be phrased differently. So in qualitative research, the questions should be shaped by the gaps you have identified in the extant study or literature you have reviewed. In quantitative research, the hypothesis should be based on relevant theories. Sometimes it may be based on the empirical results of previous studies or some reliable arguments that you have seen or come across in the literature. In all of this, we always say that you have to clearly show an indication of problematizing the literature. And problematizing the literature is a means of identifying and challenging the existing assumptions that are in the existing literature. It is only through this that you'll be able to clearly see or show the gaps that are there and clearly come up with your research questions or hypothesis. Now, when you have done this, the next stage would be your methodology. And your research methodology provides evidence of your ability to be able to achieve your research objectives, your ability to be able to answer your research questions and achieve the research objectives. Under the methodology, we have to clearly indicate what research method we are using. So under the methodology, you may clearly indicate that this study is a quantitative study. But if it is a quantitative study, then it will be informed, the fact that it is quantitative would inform what kind of research method you will rely on. Even before that, sometimes you may come across a research paper, especially when it is a qualitative paper, especially for those of us in the IS field. Under the research methodology, you may have to clearly indicate what your research paradigm is. And your research paradigm basically are the philosophical assumptions that will underlie your study. And these philosophical assumptions that will underlie your study will shape how you would see things in your study. If your study is going to be positivist or objective or interpretivist or subjective, it will influence the kind of research methodology or research method you will use. So assuming my study is interpretive, maybe I would go with qualitative study, and maybe my research method may be a case study method. Now, the research method, if it's a qualitative study, and examples of the research methods you may use may be the case study method. You may also use action research where your intention is to address a practical problem out there, or you may also use ethnography or grounded theory. But if you are considering the kind of research we do, and if you are doing a thesis, it is not advisable that your research method may be ethnography or grounded theory. You may be using maybe case study method or some other method. So when you are clear about what your method is, the next thing would be for you to clearly indicate how your data where your data is going to come from, your data sources. Where are they going to come from and how are you going to collect it? It should be clear. The data will largely be either primary, you are going to use an interview guide, focus group discussions, or secondary, you are going to rely on some archival data. Aspects of this clearly will be handled by the second presenter. Then it will also indicate, your methodology will also indicate your sampling, the selection criteria, the size of your sample. For instance, if you are using a qualitative study, you are using case study as your research method, and you have used an interview guide, you have collected your data through interviews. Your sampling will differ from somebody who is using a survey. So if you are using a qualitative study, your sampling may be that you are going to sample purposely, and your sample size may not be predetermined. Your sample size may depend when you reach a saturation point. But if you are using some kind of a quantitative methodology and a quantitative method, maybe survey to collect your data, you can predetermine that. For instance, if you are using maybe structure equation modeling, the easiest way is to try and find out from the construct you are investigating, the construct with the highest number of indicators. And then you use the 10 times rule to be able to determine your sample size. When you have done this, depending on also whether you are using a qualitative or quantitative methodology, your data analysis approach will differ. So based on your philosophy, whether it is positivist, it is interpretivist, based on your methodology, whether it is qualitative or quantitative, and based on your research method, whether it is case study, action research, or ethnography, your analysis would also depend on that. So you cannot collect interview data and then you want to use some kind of a quantitative data analysis approach to do that. That is why I'm saying that all these previous discussions will inform what your data analysis approach would be. So for instance, if you are using a quantitative, so this aspect may involve your model development, testing, and if you are using a quantitative methodology, maybe a case study method, you have interviews, you may use hermeneutics, semiotics, narrative analysis, content analysis to be able to analyze your data. When you have done this, analyze your data, this is the point you may either start getting excited or getting demoralized. Because the next stage will be when you start seeing what your findings are, what the data is telling you. And I want to again emphasize that what the data is telling you depends on whether you are using a quantitative methodology or what, a qualitative methodology. If it is a quantitative methodology, the findings will link, you will have to link the findings in a way with your hypothesis. There should always be that link. And the evidence of your findings will be presented in maybe tables, some graphs, or some kind of a model. If you are using a qualitative study, then you also have to identify the main themes and link the findings with your respondents, the demographics of your respondents, your research questions, and the evidence of all this qualitative data will clearly be seen from the quotations from interviews, quotations from maybe people from focus group discussions, or quotations maybe from documents or whatever, some reports or whatever. You have to clearly indicate this evidence. So depending on whether it is qualitative or quantitative, how you present your findings will differ. Now, when you have presented your findings, the next key section will be for you to discuss them. You have to discuss your findings. The discussion section will clearly summarize your key findings by focusing on the novel findings and insights that has been presented by your data analysis. Your findings will clearly indicate that. And you have to do this discussion in relation to the literature. You have to relate it to the literature. Remember that you would have previously identified gaps. You would have clearly indicated a problem. And when I keep mentioning the issue of problematizing the literature, if you have problematized the literature and it is indicated in your research problem, it is indicated in your gaps, this is where you indicate how your findings address, or your findings are in line with the previous literature or they differ from that. So as part of your discussion, you have to properly discuss your findings rather than just describing them. You have to tell a story to the reader, and this story should be coherent and it should flow. It is also important to state that you have to discuss both the issues that are significant and those that are insignificant but are relevant. And lastly, you will have to provide clearly the implications of your study. Discuss the implications of the findings you have gotten. Now, the last section, which of your paper, which you need to look at, will be after your discussions, will be the conclusion section. And the conclusion section, I want to be very emphatic about this. The conclusion section of your research paper is not a summary of the paper. Oftentimes, you see research papers out there and they make a mistake by trying to summarize the paper in the conclusion section. It is not a summary of the paper. The conclusion section actually is where you would share with readers the conclusions you have arrived at because of the study, the data you have collected, the analysis you have conducted, and the discussions. This is where you would clearly indicate the conclusions you have reached. And to do that, you have to clearly indicate that you have to create some kind of a synthesis by tying together or integrating the various issues raised in the discussion sessions. This is where you conclude and emphatically say that A is related to this or B is not related to that. This is where the author actually says it as it is indicated by his data. This is also where you will have to create a linkage between your objectives and your research questions by providing answers to the research questions. Clearly, you have to indicate that how your research questions have been answered. So even if it's not a research paper and it's a thesis, the conclusion chapter of your thesis will indicate clearly. You will have to restate all your questions, your objectives, and indicate how each of them has been arrived, instead of just summarizing what was contained in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 to the end. You don't do that. You indicate clearly how your objective, how you are providing answers to your research questions and how your objectives are being achieved. Then also you have to clearly indicate by identifying the theoretical implications of your study, because we often say that you have to contribute to knowledge, and to contribute to knowledge, you have to clearly indicate the implications of your study theoretically. And then finally, you will indicate the implications of your study for practice, policy, and then research. That will be the end of your paper. In doing all of this, you have to make sure that you cite appropriately. And the evidence of you citing appropriately will be included or will be shown in the last section of your research paper, which is the reference, which are the references. So if you also want to attach other appendices, there may be maybe an interview guide or a questionnaire, you may do that. Okay? Usually there are different kinds of referencing style depending on the journal. They may use Vancouver, APA, Chicago style, or whatever, depending on the journal. Or if it's a thesis, it depends largely on the university or the faculty requirements. And as I have indicated, you also have to clearly indicate in your appendix maybe the questionnaires, the interview guides you use, and whatnot. And yes. So this brings us to the end of my session. And I would like to end my session by indicating that, as I started by saying that those of us in academia and those of you who intend to join academia, we sign up to the mantra of either you publish or you perish. Unfortunately, Professor McWheat didn't subscribe to that mantra. And because Professor McWheat didn't subscribe to that mantra, Professor McWheat didn't publish, so he perished. I hope that this discussion we have started, we will learn a lot. And if we're in research institutions, we're in the academia, we'll be able to collaborate fruitfully so that we will not perish like Professor McWheat. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Doc, for the wonderful and very impactful and inspiring presentation. I believe our audience have learned a lot. They have followed you through up to now, and they have learned a lot. So in order for us, as I mentioned earlier, in order for us to make good use of the time or maximize our time, I'll proceed to call on the second speaker, Mr. Muftau Alassane Jang, to proceed to give us his presentation. Then afterwards, we would channel every question to each speaker to address. Thank you very much, Doc.
Thank you.
Mr. Muftau, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here, Muda.
Great.
So I'm
So,
just sharing my screen right away.
all right. Okay.
So that, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we can see your slide now.
Okay. So thank you very much, Muda. Good afternoon to
Okay,
everyone.
before you proceed, I did like to highlight that those of us who have invited their friends and they are saying they are not able to join, I think we have had over 100 participants currently and the Zoom is not able to accommodate that. But you can share to them our Facebook Live link and they can go and follow the session from there. I've sent the link in the chat. I'll resend it again so you can also forward it to your friends who are having difficulties to join on the Zoom. Probably they will have it easy to join on the Facebook. Thank you. Mr. Mufta, you can continue.
Okay, thank you, Muda, once again. Good afternoon to everyone. And thank you, Dr. Ibrahim Osman Adam, for a wonderful presentation. Specifically, he took us through how we can write a research paper for a refereed conference or journal. And he took us through the components of a research paper. So he took us through what the abstract should contain, the title, the introduction, the literature review, the hypothesis development, and then the methodology where I come in, the analysis and results, the discussion, the conclusion, as well as referencing. So thank you very much. My name is Mufta Ojang Al-Hassan. I'm the programs director at the Center for ICT for D, as well as a lecturer at the University of Business and Integrated Development Studies, WA, Ghana. And I'll delve straight into my contents for this presentation. So I'll first look at the methodology, as I said, the analysis and results, discussion, and conclusion, implications, and future research. So Dr. Ibrahim spoke about research questions and research objectives. So for every research, we need to ensure we achieve our research objective by answering some research, empirically answering some research questions. So to answer these research questions empirically, as well as to achieve our research objective, we need to collect data. Now, this data could be in two types, or this data is mainly two types. We could have qualitative data that is concerned with categories. So we have gender, you could either be a male or a female. You could have hair color, which could either be white, it could be brown, which could be black, amongst others. Or we could have quantitative data, which is mostly concerned with what? Numbers. So the number of students in a class, the number of people on board a flight or a plane, a bus, amongst others. Now we hope to, in the near future, have practical seminars that goes into detail to explain how we can collect qualitative data as well as analyze it. And even we'll delve more deep into how to also collect quantitative data and analyze it. However, my presentation for this afternoon will center a bit on how we can collect qualitative data as well as analyze, quantitative data as well as analyze quantitative data. So there are two main sources for quantitative data. Now we can either rely on a survey where we develop a survey instrument to administer to a particular population. So we call that primary data. Or we rely on some databases by some reputable organizations for our data, which we usually call secondary data. Now, how do we go about collecting survey data? And how do we go about collecting secondary data? So for survey data, what will we need? We need a survey instrument or a questionnaire in that sense. And this questionnaire, we need to design this questionnaire. So generally, questionnaires are generally in two parts. You have the first part where you collect data on demographics. So the occupation of your population or target population, or respondents, their gender, their age, their income levels, amongst others. And then you have the second part, mostly, that collects data on your constructs. So going back to Dr. Ibrahim's presentation, you would definitely have a theory you are relying on for your study, which will have constructs or variables, which cannot be easily observed. So with these variables, you would have to do what? You'd have to measure them. You have to rely on some measurement instruments to help you measure these variables or constructs in your study. And these measurement items could either be new items that you are developing, or you can adapt these items from past or prior research. Now, having settled on your construct as well as the measurement items or the indicators, then you have to measure them using some Likert scales. So you can go with 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. Now you have your survey instrument or questionnaire ready. You then administer to your population. But before you do a pre-test and a pilot test. So a pre-test is usually done by experts. So you give it to some experts to review the language and some other issues that they might come up with in the survey instrument. Having done that, then you do the pilot test to assess for reliability and validity, which we'll talk about in the following slides. Then after reliability and validity is fine, you then do your what? Your data analysis. And for my presentation today, our data analysis will focus on partial least squares structure equation model. So now we know how to collect data, that's survey data. Now, what about secondary data? So for secondary data, we would already have our constructs so we have a model. It could either be a theory as well, or a conceptual model, a new model that is being developed by us. So now with secondary data, we would need to identify databases that host our constructs or our variables in that case, and the measurement items we want to use to measure these variables. So there are several secondary data sources available, which some include the Network Readiness Index. We have the Mobile Connectivity Index, and we have the World Development Indicators, amongst others. So now we know we are going with the quantitative data. We either have to go with a survey as a primary data or the secondary data. So we collect data either from participants using the survey instrument, or we rely on secondary data sources, databases for our secondary data. So now we have our data ready and prepped. We've worked with our missing values. We've achieved reliability and validity. We've had a pre-test done. Then we go on to analyze our data to either accept or reject our hypothesis, and to answer our research questions and meet our research objective. So as I earlier on said, the presentation today will focus on partial least squares structure equation modeling, PLS-SEM for short. So PLS-SEM is a method of SEM, which allows researchers to model, simultaneously estimate, and test complex theories. So with PLS-SEM, we are concerned about testing the causal effects, the effects of some independent variables on some dependent variables using empirical data. This data either be primary data collected using a survey instrument, or secondary data, which we gathered using some reputable databases. Now, it's a causal predictive model. PLS-SEM is a causal predictive model that underlines prediction in estimating statistical models whose structures are aimed at providing causal explanations. So with PLS-SEM, we have variables, latent variables, or constructs, which are not easily observed. As such, we need to measure them using some indicators or measurement items. So we have this latent variable called ICT access, which looks at individuals' access to what? Various ICTs. Now, because we cannot easily observe individuals' access to various ICTs, then we'll have to rely on some measures that will help us to measure ICT access. So this could either be from previous, so if you're using survey data, this could be from, we can adapt the measurement items from previous research, or if we do not have them, we could develop new measurement items to measure ICT access based on the literature. So ICT access has some indicators or measurement items. Now, aside from ICT access, we have another latent variable called ICT use, which looks at the use of individuals' use of what? Various ICTs. Now with PLS, we also have measurement items for ICT usage or ICT use. And we want to test the relationship between ICT access and ICT use. Empirically, we are saying that if individuals have access to ICTs, then they would use ICTs. And we term this as what? Hypothesis 1. And then we say that this does not end there. We also have another latent variable called digital inclusion. And we say that once individuals use ICTs, they'll be digitally included. And as well, we have measurement items for digital inclusion. And we name the relationship between ICT use and digital inclusion as what? Hypothesis 2, which we are going to test in our analysis. And then we say this does not end there. Similarly, when people have access to ICTs, then they'll be digitally included. And we name this hypothesis 3. This is what PLS-SEM enables us to what? To validate. So we have a model like this, which is made up of variables or constructs, which are measurement items, and we test the relationship between the variables, as well as between the variables and their indicators, which I'll talk about in the following slides. So we see that partial least square SEM has been widely used in many social sciences. So in recent years, a lot of social science disciplines have been relying on PLS-SEM for their analysis. So this includes marketing, management information systems, hospitality management, operations management, accounting, finance, among others. So when can we use, now we know what PLS-SEM is, when do we use partial least squares structure equation modeling? So we use PLS-SEM when we are dealing with cross-sectional data. We are saying data taken for a specific period of time, data that has not elapsed more than 1 year. So our data should just be taken at most 1 year. We rely on PLS-SEM when we are testing a theoretical framework. This framework could be a theory that we are relying on, or could be a conceptual model, a new model that we are developing, right? To test, as I earlier on showed in the previous slides, to test the relationship between the variables in our model. We also use PLS-SEM when our structural model is what? It's complex. So it includes so many constructs. So in my previous slide, I showed just 3 constructs or variables. We could have studies that have a lot of variables, a lot of constructs. And as such, it makes their models complex. So PLS-SEM is appropriate for these kind of studies. Also, when our model includes one or more formatively measured constructs. So in the following slides, on the next slides, I'll talk about formative constructs as well as reflective constructs. And then when our research is based on secondary data, it's appropriate we rely on PLS-SEM. However, our secondary data would only be data for 1 year. So data for 2018. That goes back to say that PLS-SEM supports only cross-sectional data. So PLS-SEM would not support a panel data set. So data, let's say from 2010 to 2020. PLS-SEM does not support data or studies of this nature. Also, when we have a small sample size, PLS-SEM is appropriate. However, it also works perfectly on large sample size. So in the next slide as well, I'll show the minimum sample size requirements for PLS-SEM. Also, when we have issues with data normality, we are advised to rely on PLS-SEM as per Hare et al. 2019, because PLS-SEM neutralizes or normalizes our data, unlike other approaches to structure equation model. And also, when we require latent variable scores for follow-up analysis, then PLS-SEM is appropriate. So for some studies, after they have done the analysis, they require some scores to undertake some other analysis. So for example, we have what we call necessary condition analysis. So having done PLS-SEM to identify the causal relationship between the constructs in your model, then you could probably also take latent variable scores to undertake necessary condition analysis to find out what conditions the independent variables will have to meet in order to explain the dependent variable. Now, we know what PLS-SEM is, and we know when to use PLS-SEM. Now, what is the minimum sample size for PLS-SEM? Now, in recent years, researchers have come out with several ways that we can assess the minimum sample size requirement for PLS-SEM. However, today I'm just going to focus on two of them. The first one being the 10 times rule by Hare et al. 2011, as well as Peng and Lai 2012. So the 10 times rule states that the construct with the highest, in order to get a minimum sample size for a study, you look at the constructs in your model. Which construct has the highest number of measurement items or indicators? And then you take that number and then multiply it by 10. So for example, let's look at this model that looks at ICT access, ICT regulation, and ICT usage, as well as e-participation. Now we see that for each variable or each construct, we have measurement items at the left-hand side, right? So you have to look at the construct that has the highest number of indicators, and then we'll multiply that number by 10 to get a minimum sample size requirement based on Hare et al. 2011. So we see that the construct, in fact, all the independent constructs here, which are ICT access, ICT regulation, and ICT usage, have 6 indicators or 6 measurement items. So we multiply 6 by 10, which will give us 60. So as per Hare et al. 2011, our minimum sample size for this study will be 60 respondents. That's if we are going with primary data. Now, if we are going with secondary data, then our minimum sample size will be 60 countries. Above that is perfect. However, we can take more than that. Hare et al. Also recommends that the best is between 200 and 300. So if you don't necessarily have to say that once you just hit the minimum sample size, you're going to stop. You can go ahead and take data for as much as you like. Now, apart from the 10 times rule, we also have the minimum R-squared method by Cohen. So unlike the 10 times rule, Cohen gives us a table, and then he tells us that, so you have in your model, you have to look at the number of arrows pointing at the construct. So the number of independent constructs in your model pointing at the dependent construct. So we see that in this same model, we have 3 independent constructs, which have these arrows pointing at e-participation. Now, as well as that, Cohen says that you should have a significance level that you aim to achieve. So we know that in social sciences, the preferred significance level is 5%. And he says you should also have a minimum R-squared that you want to achieve. So we see that the table gives us the maximum number of arrows pointing at the construct, the significance level of 1, 5, and 10, the minimum R-squared. So for example, in this our model, we know that we have 3 independent constructs. So the number of arrows pointing to a construct will be what? 3. And then we have the minimum R-squared of 5% if we are going with the acceptable for social sciences. So the significance level being 5%. And then you have the minimum, let's say we predict a minimum R-squared of 25. So in that case, we'll have a minimum sample size of 59 as per Cohen's minimum R-squared method. So we can either decide to go with the 10 times rule, or we can decide to go with the minimum R-squared method. So now we know how we can achieve the minimum sample size requirement for PLS-SEM. Now let's look at what softwares we can rely on to run PLS-SEM. So in recent years as well, we've had good softwares coming up that enable us to run PLS-SEM. I'll just talk about a few here. The first one being Smart PLS, which is the most popular, which can be downloaded from the Smart PLS website. Then we have Adanko as well, which can be downloaded from the Adanko website. We have the R software that also enables us to undertake PLS-SEM analysis. And we have M+, that can also be downloaded on their website. Now, this presentation, I'll focus on Smart PLS, because it's a common PLS software that is being relied on to carry out PLS-SEM analysis. So the student version for Smart PLS is free of charge. However, it gives you limited functionalities. I think the maximum sample you can rely on is, or you can use for the analysis is 100. You cannot exceed 100. So if you are dealing with primary data, you are talking about data from 100 respondents. If you are dealing with secondary data, you are talking about data from 100 countries. The issue with the student version is that you will not be able to export or download the results. And as such, you would have to rely on the 30-day trial professional version. And when it expires, you have to subscribe to the other versions that allow you to enjoy PLS-SEM, which is quite expensive. So now we know the softwares that we can rely on for PLS-SEM analysis. Now, how do we conduct PLS-SEM data analysis? So now we have our survey data ready, or we have our secondary data ready. Now, how do we conduct the analysis? So before we conduct the analysis, I want to talk about two key things. Now, in our model, we could have reflective constructs or formative constructs. So when is a construct term reflective, and when is a construct term formative? A construct is reflective if deleting one of its measurement items does not affect the originality of the construct. So in this case, we term the construct reflective if deleting X1 would not have an effect on the main construct A. So that is when we call it a reflective construct. So it has this model drawn like this with the arrows from the construct to the indicators. And the model is formative when the indicators form the construct. So we see that we have the arrows from the indicators to the what? To the construct, detailing that these indicators form the construct. As such, deleting one of these indicators would have a massive impact on the meaning of construct B. So now, having known what reflective and formative constructs are, now how do we go about analyzing reflective and formative constructs in PLS-SEM? Now, data analysis in PLS-SEM is done in two folds. As per Hare et al. 2019, we have the measurement model evaluation. What is the measurement model evaluation? The measurement model evaluation looks at the relationship between the constructs and their measurement items or their indicators. That's what the measurement model evaluation looks at. The relationship between the constructs and their measurement items or indicators, to be sure if these indicators actually measure or adequately measure the construct they are assigned to measure. So this is a measurement model evaluation. Now the structural model evaluation looks at the relationship between the constructs in your model. So the structural model evaluation looks at the relationship between the independent variables and the dependent variable in your model. Now, what do we need to look out for when we are doing a measurement model evaluation? So analysis for measurement model evaluation differs from what? Reflective models to formative models. So for reflective models, what do we have to look at? We first have to look at what? Indicator reliability. Now you have indicators that measure the construct. we need to look at how reliable these indicators measure our construct. And we have to use what? The item loadings. So here it states that loadings of at least 0.708 is adequate to ensure indicator reliability. So if you have loadings less than 0.708, then we are recommended to delete them as they do not indicate indicator reliability. Having achieved indicator reliability, we next look at what? In the internal consistency reliability. We are looking at how consistent our items what measure the construct they are assigned to measure. Now there are three ways of assessing internal consistency reliability. We can go with the Cronbach alpha values, we can go with the row A values, or we can go with the composite reliability values. Now, research nowadays advocates that we use composite reliability values as it's a better way to assess internal consistency reliability. Unlike the Cronbach alpha values that assumes that all the indicators have equal loadings. Composite reliability values does not do that. So what is the threshold for this? So the all Cronbach alpha values, row A values, or composite reliability values should score at least 0.70 as per Fornell and Lacker 1981. So if you have CR values or row A values or Cronbach alpha values less than 0.70, then you have an issue. We have to look at either our questionnaire, our measurement items in that case, or we'll have to look at our indicators. Now, having achieved internal consistency reliability, we now look at convergent validity. How our items together converge to explain our construct. So now, to achieve convergent validity, we use the average variance extracted values, which are the AV values. And as per Fornell and Lacker 1981, AV values should score at least 0.50 to ensure convergent validity. So having achieved convergent validity, we then look at what? Discriminant validity. How unique our items measure their assigned construct. So in this case, we are saying that our items should uniquely measure their assigned construct than any other construct. So there are also three measures here. We can use the cross-loadings criteria, we can use the Fornell and Lacker criteria, or we can use the what? Heterotrait monotrait ratio, which is a new measure and a recommended measure by research. So for cross-loadings, the item loadings for each construct should load highest for their constructs than for any other construct in order to achieve discriminant validity using the cross-loadings criteria. Now for Fornell and Lacker, the diagonals of the correlations between the constructs should be the highest in order to achieve discriminant validity. And for heterotrait monotrait ratio, which we popularly refer to as the HTMT criteria, the correlation between the constructs should score at most 0.90 in order to achieve discriminant validity. So these are the items we would have to consider as per Hare et al. 2019 when we are looking at the measurement model evaluation for what? For reflective models. Now, what about formative models? Now, for formative models, we first have to look at the collinearity between what? Between the items. So we look at the outer variance inflation factor values. And as per Koch 2015, this outer variance inflation factor values should score at most 3.3 to ensure that there's no collinearity between the measurement items. Having looked at collinearity, they will now look at the statistical significance of the weights. So for reflective models, we call the items what? Indicator loadings. For formative models, we call them weights. And in order to know the statistical significance of the weights, we have to do a bootstrap procedure and a smart PLS that will provide T values and P values, right, to help us make inferences. So depending on the significance level, so we know in social sciences, the acceptable is what? 5%. So the rule of thumb as per Hare et al. 2011 for significance levels of 5% one tail is what? 1.96. So in this case, if our weight score at least 1.96, then they are statistically significant, right? If you are going with a 10% two tail, then the rule of thumb is at least 1.65 as per Herta 2011. So if our weight score below 1.65, then there's a problem. But unlike reflective models where when our indicators score at less than 0.708, we delete them, informative models, there's always an issue deleting. In fact, researchers have argued that we should not even delete, because once you delete an item in a formative construct, then it distorts the meaning of the construct. So researchers have mainly argued that we should just look at the outer VIF values, and if they are fine, then we should proceed. We shouldn't think of deleting weights that score below the threshold, or that score below the p-value of 0.05. Now, we know how to undertake the measurement model evaluation for reflective models and formative models. Now let's look at the structural model evaluation. The structural model here looks at the relationship between the constructs in our model, the relationship between the individual or the independent constructs and the dependent construct. Now, unlike the measurement model evaluation that differs from formative to reflective, the structural model evaluation for both reflective models and formative models are the same. So what do we need to look out for? So as per Herta 2019, we need to first look at what? Collinearity among the constructs. So here we're looking at collinearity amongst the constructs. So we look at the inner variance inflation factor values, and they should score at most 5 in order to ensure that there's no collinearity between or amongst our constructs. So having looked at collinearity, we now look at the path significant coefficients. So here we are now taking our mind a little back to the model I showed. So here we are trying to test our hypothesis. So we have a model where we have hypothesis, hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, hypothesis 3, and so on. So here we need to test our hypothesis to see if they are significant or they are not significant. So we undertake a bootstrap procedure again in Smart PLS, and this bootstrap procedure gives us t values and p values. So depending on your significance level, if you are going with a 5% one tail, you have the rule of thumbs. And if you are going with a 10% two tail, you also have the rule of thumbs, because the bootstrap procedure will give you both t values and p values, as well as path coefficient to help you make your inferences. So having done the path significance analysis, then we look at what? Our coefficient of determination. Look at the variation in the what? The dependent variable that is explained by the independent variables. And we rely on the R-square values. So the higher the R-square value, then the higher the variation in the dependent variable that is explained by the independent variables. Having looked at the coefficient of determination, we now look at the predictive relevance. We're looking at how relevant our independent constructs are to our dependent constructs. And we use the Q-square values. So the higher the Q-square value, then the higher the relevance of our independent constructs. Then we look at what? Our effect size of the independent variables on the dependent variable. And we use the what? Cohen's F-square values. As well, the higher the F-square value, then the higher the effect size of our independent constructs. Having done this, we then look at what? Our model fit. Using the what? The standardized root mean squared residual. That's the SRMR, as per Herta 2019. So the rule of thumb to ensure a model fit is that the SRMR value should be at most 0.08 in order to ensure model fit. So now, having done this, we know how to go about doing our measurement model and our structure model. By the time we get here, we are done with, we know the hypotheses that have been accepted and the hypotheses that have not been accepted. So we go on to do what? To discuss our results. And in discussing the results, we'll have to link our findings to what? To that of what? Previous studies. So it's either our findings confirm what previous studies have done, or they what? They reject what previous, or they find otherwise. Now, In the case where your findings go contrary to previous studies, it's always imperative or it's always advisable to probably give a reason why the finding would have deviated from that of previous studies. So having completed your discussion, then you now go to conclude by providing a summary of your findings based on your research objective and your research questions. Then you provide your implications of your results to what? To research, to practice, and to policy. And then after that, you give us some limitations of your research and how they serve as a basis for what? Future research. Then you end by having your reference list that is either in line with what? With the APA style, Harvard style. That's depending on the journal style or the conference style, or depending on your institution style. So this brings me to the end of my presentation today. We hope that in the near future, I hope that in the near future, there's a seminar where I can practically take participants through how we can conduct these analysis using some either both primary data and secondary data. Thank you very much for your time. Most grateful.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Muftau Zang Al-Hassan, for the wonderful and insightful presentation. Yes, listeners, we thank you so much for being with us all this while, from the beginning all the way to the end. As I mentioned in the beginning that we will bring in the questions and answers immediately after our two speakers make their presentation. So I'll proceed to present some questions that were asked during the time of, during Dr. Ibrahim Osman's presentation. Doc, please, are you with us?
Yes, I'm around.
Okay, thank you. So I want to present to you the questions that were asked during your presentation.
Okay.
That you could address them for us. First question was asked that, must the results be discussed vis-a-vis empirical studies at all times? In which section does the researcher's own contribution or interpretation of the results come to bear?
Okay.
So this was a question asked by Daniel.
Okay.
Daniel Enos.
Yeah, Daniel, thank you very much for your question. And I think the question is in two parts. The first part is, must the results be discussed vis-a-vis empirical studies at all times? The answer is an emphatic no. But when you do your discussion section and it's all about your subjective interpretations of what the data presented, it may be problematic to many. So what usually happens is that, as indicated by the second presenter, Mr. If your findings corroborate other findings, or your findings may disagree with previous or extant literature, when you have this scenario, that is where you come in as a researcher to explain why your findings differed or why your findings agree. And that's where your subjective opinions, your subjective construction will come in. So it is not at all times that your discussion should be in relation to the literature. No. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Doc. The second question is, what is the minimum or maximum number of literature that one needs to critically review to come out with a research gap? This person asked two questions.
Okay,
and the first question,
the second one.
I should continue with the second one. Okay. The second question asks that, can conference proceedings contribute to identifying the research gaps or existing literature?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I'll go with the first in that order. The minimum or maximum number of literature one needs to critically review to come up with the research gap. In fact, there is no quantitative measure of the number of literature you should consult. However, there may be a limitation on how far back you want to draw on the literature. So for instance, if you are writing a paper which is a very trendy contemporary issue, which is currently being discussed, the only way you may go way back to maybe 10 years ago may be when you are drawing on your theoretical lens, the theoretical foundation of your paper, because the theory may have been propounded in 1960 or whatever. So you may go as way back. But if it's so trendy and contemporary, you may be limited by some time frame, maybe 5 years, maybe 6 years, maybe 3 years, something like that. So there can be a limitation in terms of how far back your literature, your references may go. But in terms of the quantum of the literature, you need to consult to come up with a gap. There is no limitation on that. But you have to be very conservative. The important thing is that your literature review should have been exhaustive enough to look at the seminal content, the seminal literature or papers in your area. So you can review 100 papers to come up with a research gap, but you may miss out on the seminal issue, the critical issue. So to be able to do this, your search skills need to be enhanced. So that these days there are nifty tools out there. You can use Google Scholar to be able to filter, limited to 5 years, limited to 3 years, limited to 10 years, but you'll be able to filter and get the literature that is most cited in relation to the phenomena you are looking at. That way, you'll be able to come up with a gap which can be supported by concrete evidence empirically. But in terms of number, no. Can conference proceedings, second part is, can conference proceedings contribute to identifying research gaps or existing literature? The answer is yes. However, if your paper or your thesis solely relies on conference proceedings, it becomes questionable. And the issue is this. You see that conference proceedings are usually work in progress papers. People go to conferences to present papers for feedback, to improve on it. So I can present a paper at a conference and the paper is not complete yet. Then I can go back and modify it and actually submit it to a journal and get it published as a journal article. That is where one has to tread very cautiously. So you can rely on conference proceedings, yes, but you have to be cautious. So when you get a conference paper, you may try to find out whether the paper was published again in a journal. The author may have improved on it and done that. But we also have conference proceedings that deal with complete papers. The paper is completed. That way you can cite it without any problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc. Yes, so I did like to just comment, listeners, I think, Doc, as you mentioned that nowadays with tech tools, we can use to refine your research based on the years and other parameters that you want. I want to highlight that in our subsequent practical workshops, I believe all these things can be taught to users to understand.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. The next question is that this question, I want to know what is the difference between a brief introduction of the research topic and the background of the study. I want to know what's the difference between the two.
Okay, so I'm going to restrict myself to my presentation first, and then maybe I can take it from there. The difference between the introduction of the research topic and the background. In fact, my presentation clearly indicated that when you have the introductory session, you are not going to write anything under that introduction. The introduction session includes the background, the problem, and all those issues. So you are writing it like a number of paragraphs. So it comes in a number of paragraphs. So you are not going to have an introduction, then you write something there. And then you go to background, you write something there. No, we are not going to do that. If you are going to write a thesis, you will have an introduction chapter. So the title of that chapter will be introduction. Then you now go to under the chapter, maybe 1.0 or 1.1, and you now have research background. That is the clear difference. But as a matter of style, you may come across research paper, somebody will have an introduction, and then you will have a background. If somebody is going with that style, what will normally come under that introduction would be a general overview. Then, and usually we say that people who adopt that style will rely on the funnel approach, the funnel. So they discuss generally issues under the introduction. Then when they get to the background, they start to narrow down to the nature and the issue and the context and what the general nature of the problem they want to investigate. So that's the difference.
Okay, thank you very much, Doc. Another questioner wants to know what's the difference between the abstract from the introduction.
Okay.
And he says that also abstracts are requested usually before you go on with the research. Okay. Meanwhile, you have mentioned that the abstract should include some of the findings.
Yes.
So they are
Yes.
confused.
How different is the abstract from the introduction? The abstract basically is a summary of what has been captured in the paper. The aim, objective, maybe the gap, the methodology, and the key finding and the key conclusion. Usually, when journals or call for papers ask for abstract, they ask for maybe an extended abstract. So you may not have actually finished the research, but they are looking for an abstract. So the abstract will indicate the aim, it will indicate the gap, and the methodology you intend to adopt, and your expected finding and expected contribution. So when abstracts are requested before the paper is published, then they are looking for expected findings and expected contributions. That's the difference.
Okay.
That's the difference, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so the second question, the next question, yeah, I think is the same, still on the abstract and the introduction thing. The next, after that question is, the questioner says, most people assert that one key way to identify a predatory journal is to ascertain whether its index is indexed by a viable online library or database, such as Scopus, Econlit, and the like. But I have recently read papers that argue that some Scopus index journals that are predatory. So the question is asking, what are the other ways that can be used to identify a predatory journal?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Before I answer that, I want to just share an experience. One thing we have to note is that you can have a predatory journal which later becomes a very well-indexed journal. So you can publish in a predatory journal, but with time, the journal will develop and become very credible. It's possible. It's possible. So that may cause a confusion. Somebody may say, oh, this journal is predatory. Then maybe several years down the line, you realize that the journal, there's some kind of a re-engineering. The journal has reinvented itself and is now indexed by a reputable library or a database. What are the other ways that one can use to identify a predatory journal? Most often than not, predatory journals, when you go to their website, before you even submit the paper, they are asking you how much you should pay. APC, article processing charge, they will be asking for money. 2, check the editors of the journal. Check the editors and just Google them. You may find that they may be non-existent. A credible editor of a journal, you will find him on Google Scholar, well published, and you will find him cited by so many. So if you find that the editor is nowhere, or the editor, you go and check the editor, and the editor has got maybe 50 citations in his Google Scholar profile, or 10. I mean, come on, you will know that these guys are. And largely also, I think the monetary aspect is the key thing. Also, the papers that are published by the journal, if you go and check there, some of them you will see, you will easily spot typos in the paper, mistakes that are avoidable in the papers that are published. And you know that, look, what kind of typesetting did they do? What kind of proofing did they do during production? And they didn't determine all these things. All these are pointers to it. And these pointers is a matter of experience. You talk to colleagues, they will show you, you go through them, you understand. You will not find these things written anywhere that these are how to identify a predatory journal. But, and sometimes too, when you visit their website, if you are an experienced researcher and you visit the journal website, the nature of the website alone tells you that these guys are not serious. They are looking for your money. Also, the review process. If a journal doesn't provide blind peer review, you ask for the submission, they ask for the submission of the paper and they send you an email to this place. Then you email within 1 week or 2 days, they come back and they say that your paper has been accepted as it is. You must be a genius. I know there are geniuses out there, but you must be a genius to send your paper for publication. And they send it to independent reviewers and they find nothing wrong with the paper. You must be part of this play, this F. So when you come across things like, you should know that these are predatory journals. They ask for your money. The processing is so quick. In fact, you need to understand the review process before easily. If the moment you understand that, you will be able to identify a predatory journal. You send a paper to a journal. The paper is maybe received by an admin assistant. They will assign it to one of the either associate editors. It goes to the chief editor, the editor-in-chief. Then they look for a reviewer. They send it to a blind reviewer. The reviewer would review, send back their reviews to the journal. The journal will now, the editor will look at the reviews. If he agrees or disagrees, he will make his comment and then send you the paper for review. It's a long process. And sometimes the journal review process can take up to a year. I have had a paper published before. We've had a paper published before, and the review process took a year, sometimes over a year. In fact, we have a paper pending after the first review. It has been pending for over 1 year now. But if we send it to a predatory journal today, tomorrow, they will say pay $100, pay $300. And when we wire the money, they will get the paper published. These are some of the ways you can identify a predatory journal. Okay, I think the questions are over 20, and we have.
In fact,
yeah, so
the questions keeps coming. I'll read the next two questions for you, Doc. Then I'll proceed to present Mr. Mufti's his questions as well. Yes, audience, you have to also note that we are on Facebook. You can interact with us there. If your questions have not been asked, you can also post your questions there. I'll be sharing our WhatsApp community group link in the chats. You can also join there, and so that you can stay updated with our programs, and also we can interact more there. Yes, Doc, please. Yes. The next question is that, please, how do you write your summary of findings under the introduction without going through the empirical analysis chapter?
Without going through the summary, the findings you indicate in the introductory section. You would carve it in such a way that the paper addresses ABC, or the paper expects to contribute to ABC. Because you cannot actually present clearly all your findings in the introduction when you have not presented your methodology, how your data was analyzed. So you will indicate the paper expects to contribute to the discourse on ABC. Are you getting it? So it is only in the analysis section that you will clearly indicate everything, but you provide a snippet of information about what the findings are going to look like at the end. Okay.
Okay. Doc, someone is asking, please, can I kindly get your phone number?
The phone number is on the flyer.
Yes. So you can pick the phone number, Doc's phone number from there. Also, you can also join the WhatsApp group. I'm sending the link right away. Doc, the last question I'm presenting to you: can limited literature on a topic in Ghana be enough to establish a research gap?
No.
For instance,
no.
Okay. For instance, application of machine learning in credit risk assessment in Ghana.
So you remember when I was indicating the gaps, I indicated that one could actually come out with a context gap, but usually we say that context gaps are weak. Context gap are weak. You can, what is asking, you can do that, but usually those context gaps are weak because it's not done in Ghana. You find it worthy of investigation. So you can still use the context gap, but you have to make sure that you are able to root the problem in the extant literature. So you may look at it from maybe globally, or maybe you look at it from the continental perspective, Africa, before you now zone it down to Ghana and then build your point from there. But you cannot just argue that because it wasn't done in Ghana, it is worthy of investigation. That is weak. Theoretically, it's weak. But it's possible, people do that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Doc. Yes, audience, have shared the WhatsApp link on the chat. Mr. Mufti, I hope you are with us, Mr. Muftao.
Yes, hello? I'm here.
Okay. A questioner asks, what is the difference between primary data and survey data?
They are the same. Primary and survey data are the same. We just tend to call it primary data, but in some places, when you say primary data, they ask that what is primary data. So it's the same thing. Primary data and survey data are the same thing. You go to the field with the survey instrument to administer to a population in order to come up with some pattern. So they are the same.
Yes. Can I also add something?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, please.
Yes, as Mufti has indicated, primary data and survey data. Primary data includes survey data. So survey data is just an example of primary data. So you can have interview data, which is also primary data. You can have data from focus group discussion, which is also primary data. So survey data is just an example of what? Primary data. So he's right by saying that primary data, survey data, same. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Doc. Yes, a questioner asks, please, Doc, can we cite a paper more than 3 times?
Yes, you can do that.
Okay, great. So we have another question here.
But over-citation can be a problem. You keep citing one paper over and over and over again. It can be problematic. People start asking, is that the only seminal paper in the area? And
Okay.
that's not possible. It cannot be just one paper. So
One paper.
that
Yes.
usually indicates that either this researcher is lazy. So you just rely on that paper and citing it over and over again. You must be able to draw on other papers too.
Yeah,
yes.
Obviously. Okay. A comment, I don't know if it is a comment or a question. It says this was a very useful webinar. Thanks to the organizers. Even though the first presentation tried to touch this, I would have loved to hear more from Doc's experience of a list of high impact journals and what they expect from manuscript and some guidance on how to easily navigate these expectations. But all in all, I'm happy I participated. I had the invite from my brother. Thank you, Kennedy Amoyanga. Thank you so much. And I look forward to future seminars.
Yes,
Thank you, Daniel.
I can just share a little experience with that on this, but we can continue the discussion later on. And I think I brought an example from one of such papers, which was published in the High Impact Journal, a 3-star journal. This took quite a long time, about a year under review. But the expectation from this journal is that there must be a clear contribution to theory. These people, those in high impact journal, there must be clear contribution to theory. So if your study is not underpinned by a clear theory and informed by clear data collected and analyzed, if you are not able to do this, you can't, there's no way you can penetrate. And we see a lot of papers being published. And you see, you also have to be careful when you take a paper. Depending on the category of journal that the paper is published in, the paper may not be a predatory, the journal may not be a predatory journal, but maybe it's just some low-class journal. And the scrutiny is not that high. And so without even a clear theoretical contribution, the paper may be able to pass through. But if you want to penetrate high-impact journals, you must clearly be able to demonstrate your contribution to knowledge, clearly your contribution to theory. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Doc. In fact, we projected. Yes.
Yes, so I see someone is asking, they claim that PLS-SEM can be used with very small sample sizes, has been contested recently. What is your stand? I refer to Vinze et al. 2010.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just like to touch on that.
Before you answer that, you see that before you answer, I just want to make a reference to the citation the participant indicated, 2010. There's a contradiction in there. You said recently, but 2010.
2010, yeah.
2010. That's 12 years ago. It's not recent.
Yeah, 12 years.
Yes, so
yes.
So Doc has said one thing. Yeah. And then what I'll add is that we have to know that the use of PLS-SEM comes with minimum sample size requirements, which I spoke about. And I said that even though we have the minimum sample size requirement, Herr et al. Advocates for us to always collect data between 200 and 300. So you don't have to say because the minimum sample size is, let's say, 30. So I'm just going to use 30 respondents. No. You'd have to ensure that you have a good model fit and that you meet some reliability and validity issues as well.
Great, thanks so much. There's a comment here, very brilliant and thoughtful initiative. We look forward to subsequent trainings. Great. Yeah, I think we projected that this seminar would have ended somewhere around 12:30, but looking at the time now, it's 1:19, way beyond our projected time. So I want to believe we have exhausted almost 80% of the questions. Sorry. Okay, somebody says his hands are up. Yes. And we are running out of time as well. So I would like to just pass this information that you can join our Facebook page as well as our WhatsApp community group to keep in touch with our activities. Also, we will be organizing subsequent practical sessions in the field of research similar to this, and also technical workshops. For instance, we are planning on an upcoming web development training that will also be coming soon, I think immediately after this particular session. And we'll be also talking about a lot of, we'll be organizing sessions on several key technological topics that are currently evolving, like the IoT, the NFTs, the artificial intelligence and the metaverse and stuff. So I want to highly recommend that everyone who has made time to join should do their best to join to like our Facebook page, our YouTube, our Twitter, and also join our WhatsApp group, as well as also share it to their colleagues and friends whom they think that they will benefit from our activities. I would like to call on Mr. Adomba to speak and ask their questions, then we'll end the session. The participant by name Adomba, I've asked you to unmute and ask your question.
All right. Thank you very much for the time and everything. I think
wow, seems
the presentation was quite notwithstanding. I have a few questions regarding that of Mr. Mufti's also on first. I would like to, when it comes to that, where you have to go for the summary, where you also project the whole objectives and you discuss your findings as well. Is there any difference between the discussion that we do in that of the chapter 4 after the hypothesis has been tested and that of the summary that we do in the conclusion with regard to the chapter 5?
Okay, well noted. Mr. Mufti, I think this question is directed to you.
No, it's for Doctor. I think it's for Doctor.
Doc.
Yeah, hello, yes. Yeah, remember I indicated that the conclusion chapter is not a summary of your entire thesis. It's a summary of your key findings. And in this particular chapter, the conclusion aspect, this is where you indicate what your questions were and how the questions were addressed. In your discussion section, you are discussing the findings of your study, that is what is in relation to what you set out to achieve. So when I say in relation to what you set out to achieve, in relation to your gaps, that's what you do. But in the summary, you just indicate what your clear objectives were and how your findings address these objectives or answers the questions. So you go straight to the point in the concluding aspect. But in the discussion aspect, you are a bit detailed there, indicating how your findings. So in the discussion section, the researchers' own subjective interpretation of the finding is there. The researchers' relation of how the findings are connected to the existing literature is also there. Then you just provide your objective or your questions in the summary chapter and indicate how the objectives satisfy them. Is that okay?
All right, thank you very much, Doc. All right, so the next question will be for Mr. Mufti. With regard to acquiring a sample size, I think aside Health ETA 2011, that is the rule of 10. I think he also proposed another rule of 5, which says that you can also multiply the whole items in the questionnaire or the survey skill, and you multiply it by 5 to also acquire a sample size. I don't know if it is also useful to be doing that with regard to every research work.
Yes. I earlier on said that there are so many rule of thumbs that have come out recently regarding the minimum sample size requirement for PLS-SEM. Now, you would have to be very careful with the kind of minimum sample size you are using. You have to ensure that this minimum sample size requirement have actually been used and validated by prior studies. For the minimum sample size requirement you are talking about, which comes from here, we have to look at how PLS-SEM has evolved, right? So
okay,
yes, so that's probably the minimum sample size requirement stated way back, and now there are a lot of minimum sample size requirements coming up. So you still have researchers probably just saying that even though these ones are good, but we are recommending these new ones which are a bit better for determining minimum sample size requirements. So
okay,
as much as possible.
all right, thank you.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Okay, so we have a lot of hands still up. Okay, I want to just give chance to 2 people who haven't asked questions via the chat to do that. Gidard Awini.
I think the timing is almost 1:30.
Yes.
So we can continue the discussion in the WhatsApp group. Otherwise, the question.
Yeah,
yes.
That's
okay,
true.
thank you. Can I ask, or I have to go to the WhatsApp chat room? I don't know.
Yeah, I think, sorry, but I think
group.
our resource personnel also have other appointments to catch up with, and I wouldn't want to keep them here too long. So
that's great. If you can share that with us,
yes.
we'll be grateful.
So the WhatsApp group is, the link is shared in the chat. You can join the WhatsApp group, or you can follow the Facebook page as well, and then send your questions there.
No problem.
Thank you once again for joining our maiden research seminar. This is just the beginning, as I have mentioned. There are more to come, and to stay glued with us, you have to join all our social media handles and our community pages. So I want to thank Dr. Ibrahim Osman Adam, our first speaker, and Mr. Miftah Al-Hassan Jang as well for the wonderful and educative presentation they have given us. And thank to all participants. So see you guys on the other side. Bye.
All right, bye.